I've been working on this video for quite a bit now. I think it confronts some serious topics that I've encountered more now in D&D than ever before, and it's a sentiment to how much people are willing to share on a topic they find important, because it is an important topic. Racism and blanket discrimination in any artistic medium is difficult to confront, but in D&D it's especially difficult for a couple of reasons. One, the game was made in 1974 by Gary Gygax, an individual, and then the game was sold to Wizards of the Coast, who sought to make it a multi-million-dollar idea. The second thing that makes this really difficult is that a lot of D&D's content, well, most of it, isn't original. Of course, you have things like Displacer Beasts and Mind Flayers and Beholders. Those are all intellectual property of Wizards of the Coast, but you also have things like Giants and Pixies and the Catablopus, which are all folklore that have existed for hundreds of years, quite literally. So where do you draw the line when it comes to discrimination and racist coding in some of these fantasy creatures? And of course, elves and dwarves all have their kind of Tolkien roots. So it's a difficult topic to tackle. This video is a response to some of the ideas that I've seen expressed within the D&D community, as well as a response to Wizards of the Coast for some of their ideas that seem to be solutions for these community ideas, but really aren't effective, and I dislike them quite a bit. We'll be taking a look at some D&D races that have been identified and called into question for things like racism and discrimination. And hopefully, my goal is to offer tangible solutions. But first, why are we talking about this at all? Wizards of the Coast releases playtest material on the D&D website periodically throughout the year. It's called Unearthed Arcana. It's typical, and some of the playtest material goes over well and is tweaked like the new subclasses from Fizban's Treasury of Dragons. Others are constantly tweaked and abandoned, like the Scion or Mystic class that got 3 entire documents dedicated to it before being scrapped and turned into psionic abilities. And then, there are the ones that no one likes. As of the making of this video, the latest Unearthed Arcana is the Travelers of the Multiverse. It introduces new races like the Astral Elf and Plasmoid, and some returning favorites like the Gif. But it's the beginning of the document that really turned me away and has me concerned about the future of D&D. It starts with the Creating Your Character section, where it asks you to follow the additional rules provided here when selecting a race. The new ability score improvement rules are provided, which eliminate racial bonuses in favor of a flat +2 and +1 to any score, or a +1/+1/+1 option. This is already kind of a controversial rule, but it seems to be here to stay. In the newer books, any race that's brought up no longer has the +2/+1 to specific stats that they dictate in the books. Instead, it's a flat +2/+1 to any scores that you want that are provided in those books. Moving to the language section, it's pretty standard, as is the creature type, but lifespan and height and weight is where it really gets unfortunately uniform. Height and weight says that player characters, regardless of race, typically fall into the same ranges of height and weight that humans have in our world, which is a little weird. Halflings are typically 40 pounds, or normally 18 kilograms, and Goliaths are typically between 7 and 8 feet tall. Why homogenize heights and weights? But the lifespan is what really disappointed me. It says, the typical lifespan of a player character in the D&D multiverse is about a century, assuming the character doesn't meet a violent end on an adventure. They have another line about members of some races, such as dwarves and elves, can live for centuries, a fact noted in the description of the race, but why make this a thing at all? I understand that this is playtest material, but they don't just come up with playtest material randomly. There's a reason they created this. It's presented as an alternative or an improvement to the current system, but why? The varied lifespans of races in D&D provide solid groundwork for amazing cultures and historical differences. Elves live over 5 times longer than humans. The norms surrounding adulthood and education and long-term versus short-term goals in life and war change. Aarakocra live even shorter lives than humans. Most don't live past 30. Imagine how rapid and precious each moment must be when your children reach maturity at the age of 3. So now the standard here is to normalize all that? Why? This brings us to the complicated topic of racism in the fantasy genre. At least in my eyes, this is the only reason I can see for them normalizing all the races, other than maybe it is easier for designing campaigns not having to worry about racial differences, but even then, lots of the campaigns that they create are already within established worlds with established characters, so I don't know, it doesn't seem to track very well. This seems like a divergent point where Wizards of the Coast is trying to eliminate any kind of racist connotations that certain D&D races might have. But I'm gonna be honest here, I don't like the way that Wizards of the Coast is proposing to do this. But that doesn't mean it's not important to evaluate how real-life racism contributes to the negative connotations found in some fantasy races. So that's what we're gonna do. We're going to evaluate 2 fantasy races that have stirred the most controversy, and then, because I'm here to provide tangible solutions, we're going to provide a system that's better than the one that Wizards of the Coast has provided themselves. So, let's start. Orcs are not the creation of Gary Gygax or anyone from Wizards of the Coast. The most recognizable version of orcs come from the mind of J.R.R. Tolkien in Lord of the Rings. Even he might have taken inspiration from the Epic of Beowulf, where Orcneas has an unknown translation, but considering in Latin Orcus was the underworld and Neus was corpses, it's safe to say Orcneas was something evil. Or he might have taken inspiration from Hereward the Wake, Last of the English, which was an 1866 Charles Kingsley novel about an English folk hero. The book mentions orcs in a list of monsters on page 60 of this Cornell copy, along with dragons, giants, rocks, griffins, and chimeras. As if orc was a common creature. It's interesting considering Tolkien conceived the original stories of Lord of the Rings as ancient English mythology. So orcs were already built evil before Tolkien, but the idea of racism comes from after he expands upon them. Those that look even a little bit into this topic would find a June 1958 letter by Tolkien to Forrest James Ackerman, a prominent science fiction author, and someone that was actually working on a script for a Lord of the Rings movie that never saw the light of day. Tolkien complained about the recent script for the movie, with one of his complaints about how they made the orcs more like birds than the creatures he imagined. Quote, "The orcs are definitely stated to be corruptions of the human form seen in elves and men. They are, or were, squat, broad, flat-nosed, sallow-skinned, with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely Mongol types." Now, this video will not go into the incredibly complex discussion that is Tolkien and his works. There have been countless scholars over many, many decades that have tried to discuss how discrimination plays a role in Tolkien's works, and if they do at all, so I'm leaving that out entirely. What is important is to evaluate how the orcs in Tolkien's writings have influenced the orcs in D&D. So where does this influence from Tolkien differ in D&D? Honestly, not really anywhere. You could argue that half-orcs maybe push orcs more towards neutral than always evil, or that there are very specific, barely referenced stories in Dungeons & Dragons, like King Many Arrows, who was a smart orc leader, but by and large, orcs are going to be the hit things hard enemy. Things get even more complicated when you choose to play an orc as a player character. There's monstrous options outlined in Volo's Guide to Monsters, and orcs have +2 to strength, +1 to constitution, and -2 to intelligence. To further cement that there's something going on here with the idea that they're supposed to be always big and dumb, they have racial traits and abilities called menacing and aggressive. It's striking, for sure. Orcs are meant to be big, dumb enemies that crush things and enjoy war. It's tough to say whether in D&D specifically, orcs are meant to be explicitly racist, but the letter that Tolkien sent was pretty explicit, and it's tough because It's not a really well-known letter, nor is it the basis for the history of orcs in Lord of the Rings, or the basis for orcs in D&D. So that's why these things are complicated. Yes, there's racist coding in the orcs themselves, but you don't have to play them like that. There's room for improvement. And, well, we'll get back to the main problem I have with all the races in D&D, but for now, let's move on to the Drow. Drow are some of the most popular D&D creatures ever created. They were mentioned in the first edition of the game way back in 1977, seen as enemies in Descent into the Depth of the Earth in 1978, and became playable in 1985. All is well and good, but how are they depicted? Drow are just elves in physical morphology, but have coloring differences. They have black skin and red eyes and are all considered evil since they follow the spider goddess Lolth. Of course, there are exceptions, but this dark-skinned and inherently evil nature can be seen as a racist depiction. There's also this idea that lots of art of Drizzt Do'Urden, a very notable example of a good Drow that's probably the most popular Forgotten Realms hero, has constantly been whitewashed over the years compared to other depictions of Drow. There's not much more that can be said about the Drow. Again, there are racist connotations, but they're not the strongest, and that's why there's so much room for improvement, and the Drow have been getting a huge diversity treatment within the books and within the lore, so it's really great. There's new groups of Drow that have completely rejected Lolth, and, so many stories that can be developed off of that, which is the content that I really enjoy, and that's how you improve from here. I'm going to talk about one more kind of non-racial thing. There are certain groups in some of the D&D stories, certainly Chult, I can't even go into that. There's so much we live in a jungle, so we're going to be tribal people and, have backwards ways. It's that kind of stuff needs to be completely removed. There's so much you can do with telling stories of how people live in jungles, and that's not it. It doesn't have to be that. There's another one called the Vistani that are in the Curse of Strahd. And they're a little bit more complicated. The Vistani people in Curse of Strahd have some pretty striking similarities to stereotypes of Romani people. They're wanderers and fortune tellers and are superstitious and wear colorful clothing and drink heartily. It's something that they've tried to correct in the new Curse of Strahd revisited version, as well as Van Richten's guide, but there's still some complaints, and there's still a way to go, and there's still things to work on, and why were things like that in the first place is a question that we should all be asking. So, let's just go to improvements now. I think the ending points of our analysis of both the Drow and the Orcs are good points to take note of, because Wizards of the Coast solution to the Orc problem was just to remove the -2 intelligence modifier and then push the Orcs towards a more human build. But that's not really a solution. It makes the game less complex and interesting. Instead, they should be expanding upon the Orcs because they really haven't done that over the years. Yes, there are 2 kingdoms that are kind of a footnote where the Orcs ruled and they weren't all about bloodshed and war, but they're not at the forefront of what Orcs are or in any D&D story. So, is it really that much of a difference? Take, for example, someone like the Drow. The Drow were originally always evil, and then they became playable, and then Drizzt, who's the most popular D&D character, was released, and he is, a good Drow. Now, in the lore and the books, there are Drow who are, they reject evil. They reject Lolth. They are a part of the Avon Drow and the Lauren Drow, who are groups that have, again, rejected this evil. There's complexity to their stories. The Drow make for a much more culturally rich story in D&D. They were elves who were too violent during the Crown Wars, so they were banished to the Underdark. Lolth misled them. Most of them are evil. Some of them reject her ways. I don't see that at all as a racist depiction. It has nothing to do with inherent evil or their skin color. It's just cultural shifts over time, and it makes for a really enriching story. I chose 2 D&D races that have come under criticism for possible racist roots. An argument could be made for both. But it's what Wizards of the Coast does now to correct some of those origins to really improve how they're played in the future. Again, I've mentioned, I like the way that Drow are moving, the direction that they move, but Orcs aren't really getting any direction to move in. They're stagnant, and none of the changes are seen in the mainstream. So, we should talk about improvements. Solution number 1 is to expand upon the races that you already have and stop making new races that are so one note. I understand, it's fun to create new races and to see new content, but honestly, if those races have no story, no culture, no background, then it's literally just stats on a piece of paper. Or it's up to the DM to come up with some way that they fit into the world, which is also fine, but it feels like Wizards of the Coast should be pulling a little bit more of their weight considering the origins of some of their races that they've assimilated in the past. Solution 2 is more of a mechanical one. I think a huge takeaway from this video is that D&D has some really weird things when it comes to race and mixing biology and cultural traits in this kind of broken system. But the solution is actually right there in front of us, already built into the game. When you choose to build a character, you choose a class, you choose a race, and you choose a background. So that's what I propose. Backgrounds should hold all of the cultural traits, and race should hold all of the biological traits. Don't remove any of the biological traits from the races that make them unique and interesting, but certainly don't include weird cultural traits into them that would assume that culture is directly tied to the race that you are. Now you can still have interesting questions like, what do you do when you're sun sensitive? Your entire race is, where do you live? Or what kind of foods can you eat if you're resistant to poisons? Or how does your society develop when you only need to sleep for 4 hours? It's kind of interesting. So here's the moment of truth. I've gone through every single race in the game, and I've removed the traits that I believe are cultural and the ones that are biological. For example, wood elves knowing how to use a longsword really doesn't make sense as a biological trait. It seems more cultural. Imagine, you're a wood elf and you come out of the womb and you know how to use a longsword. It's a strange thought to me. So, that's a cultural trait. This is how it works. Choose a race like normal, but this time you only get the biological traits. And then, based on the list of cultural traits that were previously in the game for that race, you get to replace any one of those cultural traits with a cultural trait from another race or one of the new cultural traits that I've provided in a new list. I think the system's really elegant, and I think it works out well. If you have any ideas for new cultural traits, you can ask your DM and try to add them. If your race doesn't get access to any cultural traits, you can, again, ask your DM. A lot of them aren't that overpowered, and it's just something nice that you can add to your character. The document is down below and can be downloaded for absolutely free, and just as a personal anecdote, there's a character in a campaign that I run named Alvar. He's a gnome, but he was raised by dwarves. Does he have dwarven poison resistance? No, because he's not biologically a dwarf. But does he have stone cunning because he was raised by people that, were tinkerers and builders, and they certainly know how to build houses? Yes, he is stone cunning. So those are the kinds of cultural things that I really wish to ingrain into the game with this newer system. This certainly was a heavier video, but I hope it has some positive change. I'll say it again. I don't think Wizards of the Coast homogenizing all of the races is a good or creative solution to the problem. Yes, if all of your races are the same as humans, then you don't run into the problem of any racist connotations. But it makes the game boring and lifeless. Instead, they should work on improving what they have, they should acknowledge their mistakes, and they should build something new. Thank you for watching.